So here are some tips and some ideas for best using the tabla sound. Tabla is used very well in ostinato patterns or patterns which are repeated because obviously that fits in with a sort of tabla way of thinking of having a cyclic pattern or a journey, and you can then improvise around that. I'm going to start off by speaking about an obvious feature of the drum, and that is that there are two of them. Why are there two drums? Yeah, one's a low sounding drum and one's a high sounding drum, but why do you need a low sounding drum? Why just not have a high sounding drum? Yes, it adds another sound, a low sounding drum, but the purpose, or one of the purposes of having a lower drum is to create a natural accent. So if I play a pattern, a sort of 6/8 pattern on the right hand drum only, the smaller drum, you may not know where the downbeat is until I do this. So given that the tabla is a soft instrument and it doesn't have a huge dynamic range like a marimba or a bass drum, for example, the lower sounding drum is used very effectively to create a downbeat, which is usually an accented beat, or to create an accent in the middle of a cycle. As you may have noticed there, I also use the glissando as an upbeat. And in Indian traditional rhythms, it's very common that that happens. So it really is a bit like a and now, 2, 3, and now, 2, 3. One of the questions that I'm asked frequently is, can you slide backwards? Now, the answer to that is no, because by the time your hand has reached the sort of center of the drum, there's no sound to slide back on. I couldn't do that because I'm already muting it. So even though in theory it sounds like an interesting idea, it's not possible to slide backwards. What is possible is to adjust the pressure of the heel of your hand to create a sort of pitch deflection or range. So if I did this, so that's a useful thing to know about, although you can't really, although each one of those sounds that I played does have a pitch, it's not a reliable pitch. The lower drum is tuned very loosely, and it's affected, both drums actually are affected by humidity and moisture and temperature, and the lower drum is definitely affected by that because it's metal. Temperature changes and humidity changes seem to affect it more. So I couldn't really play defined notes on that, although relatively speaking it is a bit like a sort of broomstick bass line, if you know what that is. A very important feature of notating tabla is to really be aware of what I spoke about before, that the hands are divided into a 2 and a 1. So when doing rolls or fast passages, they normally end up being written as a sort of triplet, but they're not triplets. But when I say triplet, I mean in a sort of 3 mode. So when you're writing a series of closed sounds using cross note heads, the best way of doing it is to have 1, 2 on the smaller drum, which is the top line, 1 strike on the lower line, and then continue again with that pattern. And of course, again, you can choose where to put your accent. So it could be on the first beat, or it could be, but wherever you wanted it to be. Naturally, from a sort of human body perspective, the first strike is made up of 3 fingers. So it tends to have a slightly louder sound to it compared to the one with the index finger. I'll just play it now to demonstrate to you. There is a very subtle difference, and perhaps some traditional tabla players may not like the idea of having the same notation for both. If you're sitting close to the tabla like I am, I can certainly feel a difference between the two. But I think once you get to 2 or 3 feet away, you probably don't hear the difference. And also, if you do hear a difference, I think the question to ask is, from a functionality point of view, does that difference matter? It's a closed sound. So whether that's played like that or like that is arguably a conversation to have at another point, but I don't think it makes a lot of difference. So in my notation system, these are notated the same way as a cross noted on the top line. But just coming back to my point about writing rolls and fast passages of close sounds in succession, then the best way to do that, I think, is to always have it with 2 on the top line, 1 on the bottom line, and 2 on the top line again. You don't need to start with the top line. You could also start with the bottom line if you wanted to. But once you're in that roll, then try and keep to that 2-1 formation. Rolls don't necessarily need to be rhythmical. Of course, if you're playing a pattern and you want to include a slow roll into that pattern, then of course it's rhythmical. For example, that's obviously a rhythmical pattern made up of open and closed sounds. But if you wanted a sort of tremolo, there's no reason why you can't notate that as you would normally with the stem and the cross hashes to show that you want a tremolo. Sometimes I even put a line across the length of the tremolo or roll required, because in that instant rhythm is not important. It's more about the texture of the sound that you're looking for as a composer. If you're writing a tabla score and you know that the performer will be a traditional Indian tabla player, there is no reason, if you've got a repeated pattern or cyclic pattern that you wanted that person to improvise around, there's no reason why you couldn't say in your score, improvise around this pattern, but maybe keep the accents the same. Tabla players are experts of doing that, as I mentioned earlier on before the tutorial. So there's no reason why you can't do that. But again, I think it's important to clarify or be very clear about what you want the performer to do. So sometimes when I perform, people write improvise around this pattern with only open sounds, or perhaps with only closed sounds. And you can be more specific about what you want for those particular areas of your composition. So let's talk about tuning. Now, tablas obviously have a very distinct pitch, but they fall under the category of unpitched percussion. You could argue that a bongo drum is also tuned. If I was to play this, that is a note. No. It's probably a note that, I don't know how to say this, but it's probably a note that doesn't matter, so to speak, in the genre of music that it's performed in. But the moment I do this, it then becomes musical in a way. Has definitely got an interval or something about it. Nevertheless, these are short sounds, and in the genres of music that they are played regularly, they don't affect the chordal progression or the melodic side of things, and they're not designed to do that anyway. Whereas because a tabla has a resonant sound, it has to be tuned to a particular pitch. And it also, as a composer, you need to bear in mind the pitch of the drum. Now, what happens in traditional Indian music is that the tabla is tuned, this tabla, the smaller drum, is tuned to a particular pitch, and that is normally the tonic of the raga that's being performed. So if the raga is performed in C sharp or C, the tabla player would tune this tabla to that note. Now, I'm not sure what that is at the moment, but I think it is probably a C or something like that. And what happens is the tabla player would tune his or her drum using a hammer. And I'm not going to go into how to tune the tabla at the moment because it can be a bit laborious. But by knocking these chocks up and down and adjusting the plat, a tabla can be tuned to a particular note. There are tablas for different notes. This one couldn't go down an octave, for example. It just wouldn't sound at all, probably. So each tabla has its own preferred range of sounds. If I wanted a really low-sounding tabla, I would go for a larger diameter. And as a composer, if you wanted a tabla tuned to A3, for example, then as a tabla player, I would bring one of those tablas along rather than just turn up with one that normally sounds good in a higher register. So it's important to specify what tuning you'd like in your tabla. One thing that Indian musicians haven't really harnessed, in my opinion, is the feature that I spoke about earlier on, which is when you play a fully open note, which is the note head with the circle above it or below it, that has a different pitch. So if I tuned my tabla to a C, let's assume that's a C, this note will be a D in the lower register. So when I watch Indian classical recitals and the tabla player is doing a lot of that in a C-based rag, it does, I have to say, grate with me slightly. And although it's a lovely sound, it doesn't always work musically. And I have to say, I do think many tabla players are unaware of that feature. I think many people think that I've tuned my tabla to C and I'm playing a C. No, but that's a D, by the way. Anyway, I won't go on about that too much. So here's another thing. As a composer, if the C, for example, doesn't work in a part of your composition, there's no reason why you couldn't restrict the sounds to closed sounds there. There's also no reason why you couldn't modulate and ask the tabla player to move to another small drum. So sometimes when I perform with Western musicians, let's call them Western musicians, even though I consider myself Western now as well. But when I work in a Western genre and there's a modulation or there's a key change, sometimes I have another maybe one or two tablas to the side of me, smaller tablas, that I then can move to. But obviously, as a composer, when you're writing for tabla, you need to allow time for the tabla player to move to that. It does take that amount of time. What I would do is notate it just above, just put a text notation above the stave to say go to tabla D or go to tabla F, and make sure you're clear about that. But there's no reason why you can't do that. Okay, so that's the end of this video. I hope you've enjoyed watching it, and I do hope it's been useful to you. As I said before, if you have any questions, then please go to the website of my company, which is Keda Music, and I'll put the address on the screen here. There are lots of resources and support material for you as a composer on that site. And again, if you want to remember the notations for each sound, then just go to the strikes and sound page, and then there will be a chart there which will help you to remember the symbols for each of the notes. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for your interest and showing interest in this fairly new concept, I think, but I think it is the future of tabla. There's no reason why tabla cannot be performed in an orchestra just like any other percussion instrument. See you soon. Thank you.